little girl overheard the guards speaking in Spanish and told the Millionaire CEO not to get into the car. The night pressed heavy against the hills outside Madrid, a restless sky growling with thunder as if warning that something in the world was about to shift. And inside his glass-walled mansion, Alexander Knight stood before the wide window, watching the rain smear silver trails down the panes, thinking that for all his wealth and control he could not command the heavens to still themselves. The storm outside seemed to echo the one inside him, the quiet ache that success had never managed to drown. He had built empires out of numbers, conquered markets that others called impossible, yet at 38 he felt strangely hollow, like a statue polished on the surface but carved around a void. The boardrooms had taught him precision, the investors had demanded perfection, and in giving both he had traded away the softer parts of himself until even his reflection in the glass felt like an adversary. The wind lashed the terrace, bending the cypress trees that lined the driveway, and somewhere in the distance a bell chimed, a lonely metallic sound carried through the rain that made him remember the nights of his childhood, when he would hide beneath a blanket as storms rattled the windows of his parents' small apartment, his mother's lullaby weaving through the thunder. It had been decades since he'd heard that melody, yet tonight its ghost hummed faintly in the back of his mind. He told himself he stayed late at the office because he loved the challenge. But the truth was simpler. Work was the only noise loud enough to drown the silence waiting at home. When he finally drove back through the gates of his estate, the wipers thudding, lightning spilling across the sky like torn fabric, the mansion loomed ahead, grand, immaculate, utterly lifeless. He stepped inside, loosened his tie, and let the thunder fill the empty halls. It almost sounded like applause, though no one had clapped for him in years. The household staff had long since retired to their quarters, leaving only 2 guards posted at the main entrance, silhouettes behind the blur of rain. Alexander poured himself a drink, amber light trembling through the glass, and tried to lose himself in the warmth, but unease crawled beneath his skin. Maybe it was the weather, maybe the quiet, but something felt off, like the air itself was waiting. He moved through the corridor, the soles of his shoes echoing softly, and paused by the marble staircase where the portraits of his ancestors stared down with painted indifference, men and women who had known fortune, but perhaps not peace. A crack of thunder snapped him back to the present. Then, beneath it, came another sound, so gentle he almost dismissed it. A knock, soft, hesitant, almost pleading. For a moment he thought it was imagination. Who would be at his door in a storm like this? Yet it came again, 3 timid taps swallowed by the rain. He set the glass aside and walked to the front entrance. The guards were supposed to manage visitors, but the knocking felt direct, as if meant for him alone. He opened the heavy door, and the cold night rushed in with the scent of wet earth and lightning. On the threshold stood a little girl, no more than 8, soaked to the bone, hair clinging to her cheeks, a threadbare coat hanging from her small frame, and in her arms she clutched a stuffed teddy bear so worn it looked as if it had survived 100 storms already. Her eyes, large and dark, lifted to his, and for a second the world seemed to still. The rain blurred into white noise behind her. "Señor, I'm lost," she said, her voice trembling. Alexander blinked, trying to process the image before him. He had negotiated billion-dollar merge. Ours faced ruthless journalists, but he had never been disarmed like this. He glanced toward the guardhouse where faint lights flickered, and one of the men hurried forward, shouting over the rain that they had found the child wandering near the outer fence. She had no identification, no family nearby, and claimed she had been walking since afternoon. "We should call the police," one guard said, but Alexander, moved by something he couldn't name, raised a hand. "Bring her inside," he ordered. "She's just a child." The men hesitated, glancing at each other, perhaps uncomfortable with the break in protocol, but his tone allowed no argument. As they led her across the foyer's polished marble, puddles formed beneath her small shoes. Alexander knelt slightly to meet her gaze, noticing the dirt beneath her fingernails, the way her lips trembled from cold, and the stubborn dignity in her posture, despite everything. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lucia," she whispered, clutching the bear tighter. "I'm hungry." Those two words pierced him deeper than he expected. He gestured toward the kitchen, calling for the housekeeper, who arrived wrapped in a robe, eyes wide with surprise at the sight of the drenched girl. They brought warm milk and a blanket, and Alexander watched from a distance as Lucia sipped slowly, her small hands shaking around the mug. She looked impossibly fragile against the grandeur of his home, an accidental visitor in a palace built for solitude. He realized he hadn't spoken kindly to anyone in days, perhaps weeks. Business required sharpness, not warmth. Yet seeing her there ignited something soft, an echo of the man he once was, before ambition hardened him. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the glass roof of the atrium. He wondered where she had come from, what family had let a child wander into the night. But each time he considered questioning her further, he saw exhaustion glazing her eyes. When she finished the meeting, "Okay," she thanked him in a small voice that sounded rehearsed, as if gratitude was her armor. The guards lingered near the doorway, uneasy, whispering that they didn't trust strays. But Alexander silenced them with a glance. "She stays here tonight," he said quietly. "The roads are flooded." He walked her to the guest room himself, the soft carpet muffling their steps. She glanced around the vast hallway, her reflection stretching across mirrors and marble, clearly overwhelmed. "This place is too big," she murmured. "You get used to it," he replied, though the truth was he never had. He opened the door to a room gently lit by a bedside lamp, gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated, then stepped in, setting her teddy on the bed, as if introducing it to the house. Alexander turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Why are you alone?" she asked innocently. He froze. No one had ever asked that question so plainly. "I'm not," he said automatically, though even as he spoke, the hollowness in the words shamed him. She tilted her head, unconvinced, then smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't need belief to offer kindness. "The storm is loud," she whispered. "Don't let it scare you." He almost laughed at the absurdity, a billionaire being comforted by a lost child, but something about her tone steadied him. "Get some sleep, Lucia," he said softly. She nodded, curling beside her teddy, and within minutes her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Alexander stood there longer than he intended, watching the rise and fall of her small shoulders, feeling the unfamiliar tug of protectiveness. He closed the door quietly and returned to his study. But the mansion no longer felt the same. The storm outside had become background to another sound, gentler, fragile, the echo of presence where loneliness had lived for too long. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, replaying the sight of her tiny figure at his doorstep. What twist of fate had driven her here tonight? There were villages miles away, yet she had reached his gates as if guided. He poured another drink but couldn't bring himself to taste it. The whiskey smelled harsh, wrong against the faint scent of lavender left from her blanket. He realized he didn't want to numb this feeling. It was raw, unfamiliar, but alive. For the first time in years, his thoughts drifted from profit margins to people, from deals to destiny. The thunder rolled again, and he found himself whispering into the empty room, "Who are you, little one?" The question hung in the air unanswered, but somewhere deep within him, a subtle certainty began to form, the sense that her arrival was not random, that storms sometimes deliver not destruction, but revelation. And as he sat there listening to the rain taper into a softer rhythm, Alexander Knight felt the smallest crack open inside the walls he had spent a lifetime building around his heart, unaware that through that crack, the first fragile light of change had already begun to seep in. The fire flickered low as midnight crept closer, and Alexander's thoughts wandered like ghosts through the hallways of his past, brushing against memories he thought he had buried under years of ambition and power. Faces of people who once mattered to him floated to the surface. His mother's tired smile, his father's calloused hands, the friends he'd left behind chasing success. all the echoes of a life he had traded for marble floors and boardroom applause. Outside, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle, the thunder fading into distant rumbles. But inside the mansion, the silence was deeper than ever, a silence that almost felt alive. He leaned back in the leather chair, staring at the ceiling where the chandelier's light fractured into golden shards, and wondered how long it had been since someone had spoken to him without agenda, without fear or calculation. Lucia's voice, fragile yet fearless, replayed in his head. "Don't let it scare you." A child's comfort, pure and instinctive, cutting through the armor of adulthood. He found himself smiling, an awkward, uncertain smile he barely recognized as his own. He thought of checking on her, making sure she was warm enough, but something inside him hesitated. Perhaps he feared waking her, or perhaps he feared feeling again the unfamiliar tenderness that her presence stirred. He rose nonetheless, unable to resist the quiet pull of curiosity, and walked slowly toward the guest wing, the mansion whispering around him with the creaks of settling wood and the low hum of hidden machinery. The door to her room was slightly ajar, and a ribbon of light spilled across the hallway carpet. He pushed it open gently and saw her sleeping, the teddy bear nestled beneath her chin, her small face peaceful despite the storm that still muttered outside. For a long moment he simply stood there, studying the innocence that time had stolen from him long ago. The sight of her stirred a deep ache, not of pity, but of recognition, as if he were looking at the part of himself he had lost on the climb to power. He thought about how strange it was that in all his years of commanding respect and fear, this small, fragile child had entered his home without permission and managed to disarm him completely, not through force, but through silence, through the simple existence of her need. A faint chill slipped through the window, and he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. She stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent, and he caught the faintest word. "Mama," whispered into the darkness like a wish. His chest tightened. He left quietly, closing the door with care, and stood in the corridor feeling the unfamiliar weight of empathy press against his ribs. Back in his study, he couldn't focus on the reports still waiting on his desk, the numbers blurred, meaningless. The empire he had built suddenly felt smaller, fragile in ways he had never admitted. He had spent years chasing control, of markets, of people, of fate. And yet tonight, a lost child had walked through his gates and shattered the illusion of that control with nothing but her presence. He looked around the grand room at the trophies of his victories, framed contracts, photographs with world leaders, awards for excellence. None of them could speak, none could thank him, none could say his name with warmth. Only the echo of the storm answered him. He stood, restless, and walked toward the window again. The rain had slowed to a whisper, tracing silver veins down the glass. Beyond the gate, the world slept beneath a shroud of mist, but inside him, a different kind of awakening had begun. He wondered who Lucia's parents were, whether they were searching for her, whether she had someone waiting who loved her, and a pang of protectiveness surged through him. Irrational, yet undeniable. He made a silent promise to himself. She would not face the world's cruelty alone tonight. Maybe tomorrow he would contact the authorities. Maybe tomorrow he would return to being the decisive CEO, but tonight he was just a man who had opened his door to a child in need. The thought steadied him more than he expected. He turned off the lamp, letting the soft glow of the fireplace fill the room, and sat again, not to work, but to feel, something he had avoided for so long. The minutes stretched, the clock ticking softly, the sound almost tender in its persistence. He thought of the years he had wasted proving himself to people who no longer mattered, the love he had forfeited because it didn't fit into a schedule, the emptiness that came from being admired but never known. Maybe fate had sent the storm as a mirror, to show him what he had become and what he could still reclaim. Somewhere upstairs the house creaked again, and he imagined Lucia stirring in her sleep, dreaming perhaps of safety for the first time in a while. The image warmed him unexpectedly, a sipastis, small fire against the long chill of loneliness. He realized then that he didn't feel quite so alone anymore. The rain eased into silence, the first calm since evening, and through the quiet came a memory. His mother's voice, soft as a lullaby, telling him that storms end so the world can breathe again. He hadn't thought of her in years, but now her words felt close, real, and as he closed his eyes, he could almost see her face illuminated by lightning the way he remembered from childhood. He thought of how she used to open the window during storms, letting the air rush in, saying it reminded her that even chaos could be beautiful. Maybe this night was its own kind of beauty, wild, unexpected, cleansing. He rose once more, drawn to the front door where he had first seen the girl. The floor was dry now, the puddles gone, but he could still trace her faint footprints leading across the marble, tiny marks of her existence etched into the perfection of his world. He touched the doorframe, as if it could answer the questions swirling in his chest. Who was she? Why had she come to him, of all people, of all nights? The rational part of his mind whispered that it was coincidence, nothing more. A lost child, a storm, a moment of charity. But the quieter, deeper part of him, the part that rarely spoke, told him that some meetings are written long before they happen, that sometimes life sends us reminders disguised as strangers. He smiled faintly at the thought and whispered, "Sleep well, little one," though she could not hear him. Then he turned back into the vastness of his mansion, feeling something different under his feet, a sense of life returning, subtle but undeniable. The fire had almost died when he returned to the study, embers glowing faintly like tiny hearts still beating in the dark. He sat down, clasped his hands, and watched the last sparks fade into ash. Yet instead of emptiness, he felt peace. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know who the child truly was or why she had arrived, but he knew this. The storm had brought him something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. And as the final drops of rain whispered against the windows, Alexander Knight closed his eyes, unaware that on the other side of the wall, in the quiet of the guest room, Lucia's eyes had opened again, wide and watchful, as if sensing the start of a story that neither of them yet understood. Lucia sat at the long oak dining table that seemed far too big for her small frame, her thin shoulders barely rising above the polished edge as the storm outside softened to a murmur, leaving the faint tapping of raindrops against the glass. The chandeliers above cast a soft golden glow that turned her damp hair into threads of light, and for the first time in years, Alexander Knight found himself watching someone without judgment or calculation. She held the spoon with both hands, carefully lifting soup to her lips as if she were afraid it might disappear, her movements filled with quiet respect for a meal she hadn't expected to have. Every few seconds, her eyes darted to the walls, the portraits, the silver utensils, each glance filled with innocent wonder that made the grand mansion feel strangely alive. He asked her gentle questions, where she came from, who her family was. But her answers came like whispers carried by the wind, short, uncertain, wrapped in mystery. "Gone," she said simply when he asked about her parents, and something in the way her voice trembled on that single word cracked through the armor of his composure. It wasn't the word itself, but the hollow behind it, the space where a child's laughter should have been. Alexander, who had built empires on logic and control, found himself unprepared for the ache that rose in his chest. He poured her more soup even though she hadn't asked, offered her bread though she hesitated to take it, and when she finally smiled, small, shy, grateful, it felt to him like the first sunrise after years of living in winter. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, almost sacred, as if both understood that words could break what little peace they had found in that moment. He had spent countless evenings dining with investors, politicians and celebrities, yet none of them had ever made him feel seen the way that small girl did when she lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were deep brown, not the dull kind that carried fear, but the kind that held oceans, gentle, knowing, impossibly calm for someone so young. "Do you like your home?" she asked suddenly, her voice curious but kind, and he chuckled softly, realizing that no one had asked him that in years. "It's quiet," he answered, glancing around the cavernous hall. "Sometimes too quiet." Lucia nodded slowly, as though she understood far more than any 8-year-old should, and murmured, "Maybe it needs laughter." Her words, simple yet disarming, hung in the air like a promise. Later, when he led her through the grand corridors toward the guest room, her small footsteps echoed beside his steady ones, and he noticed how natural it felt to slow down for her, to match her pace. The house that had once felt like a museum suddenly seemed warmer, filled with the faint hum of her presence. He showed her the room, a cozy chamber with a view of the rain-washed gardens, and she stood there, wide-eyed, taking in every detail from the thick curtains to the plush carpet as if she was stepping into a dream she didn't quite believe was real. He handed her a towel and a clean blanket. She accepted them with both hands, whispering a soft, "Thank you," that sounded more heartfelt than any gratitude he'd ever received from business partners. When she sat on the edge of the bed, hugging her teddy bear close, he lingered at the doorway longer than he meant to, unable to turn away. Something in her stillness made him want to protect her, not out of pity, but out of an unexplainable pull, an instinct that felt older than reason. "Lucia," he said quietly, "you're safe here. Rest now." She nodded but didn't lie down right away. Her eyes followed him as he reached for the light switch, and before he could flick it off, she asked, almost in a whisper, "Do you trust your guards?" The question froze him where he stood. It was such an odd thing for a child to ask, especially one who'd just found shelter from a storm. He turned to face her, half expecting to see fear or confusion, but her expression was calm, almost protective. "Of course," he said after a pause, forcing a small smile. "They've been with me a long time." Lucia tilted her head, her gaze steady in a way that felt too mature, too intentional. "Sometimes people stay too long," she murmured, "and forget why they started." The words shouldn't have meant anything, but they lingered like a shadow in his mind. He brushed it off with a gentle laugh, saying she must be tired, and she nodded obediently, sliding under the blanket. As he switched off the lights, the room dimmed to a soft amber glow, and he stood for a moment watching her breathing even out, the rise and fall of her chest steady and peaceful. When he finally walked down the hallway back to his study, the house no longer felt empty, but alive with an invisible presence. Every creak of the wooden floor, every flicker of the candlelight seemed to echo with the soft reminder of the little girl who had appeared at his gate. He sat at his desk, pretending to read, but his mind drifted back to her words. "Do you trust your guards?" He tried to laugh at himself for letting a child's question rattle him, yet the truth was that in all his years of commanding boardrooms and orchestrating deals, no one had ever made him question his own certainty so easily. Outside, the rain began again, tapping gently against the windows, a lullaby for a house that hadn't known tenderness in years. Sleep didn't come easily to Alexander that night. He sat by the window upstairs of his study with a glass of untouched whiskey, watching the rain ripple across the surface of the courtyard pool like tiny, trembling memories. He had built this mansion to be a fortress of solitude, a place where silence was his companion and routine his protection. Yet now that silence felt like a wall closing in. His mind replayed the moment he had found Lucia standing in the storm, that fragile figure shivering beneath the thunder, and the small spark of trust that had flickered between them. For reasons he couldn't explain, her presence had unsettled the rhythm of his world. He had spent decades training himself to read people. Investors who smiled too wide, partners who spoke too fast, employees whose loyalty could be bought. But Lucia was different. There was no mask to her, no strategy, and that purity frightened him more than deceit ever had. As dawn approached, soft light crept through the heavy curtains, brushing over the cold marble floors, and for the first time in years, Alexander didn't begin his day with phone calls or reports. Instead, he found himself walking toward the guest room, drawn by something he couldn't name. When he opened the door quietly, Lucia was already awake, sitting by the window with her teddy bear propped on her knees, humming to herself. The melody was simple but beautiful, a tune that felt like it came from another life. She looked up at him and smiled, a sleepy but genuine smile that dissolved the last traces of his fatigue. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the kind of softness that made even the word morning sound new. "Good morning," he replied, leaning on the doorframe. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded. "Your house doesn't creak when it rains. That's nice." He chuckled, wondering how such small details could matter so much to a child, yet realizing that perhaps they always should. He offered to have breakfast, together, and when they sat in the smaller dining room, a place he hadn't used in years, the warmth of the sunlight filtered through the windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like golden snow. She watched them, fascinated, while he watched her, trying to understand why the sight of a child fascinated by something so ordinary could make his chest ache. Between bites of toast and sips of milk, she asked him questions that no one else would dare to. Not about business or wealth, but about life. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked simply, and he nearly choked on his coffee. He wanted to give the practiced answers, the polite denials, but something about her gaze made it impossible to lie. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice low. "Even when you have everything?" she pressed, and he smiled faintly, realizing that her innocence didn't mean ignorance. "Especially then," he said, and she nodded as if she understood completely. It was in that quiet conversation that Alexander felt something shift inside him. A small but undeniable pull toward the warmth he hadn't felt since his mother's laughter or his father's advice from decades ago. When breakfast ended, she insisted on helping the staff clear the table, her tiny hands fumbling with plates far too large for her, but he let her try because there was something healing in the sight. A reminder that kindness didn't always need to be grand. Sometimes it was found in the smallest, simplest gestures. Over the next few hours, the mansion began to breathe again. Lucia wandered through its endless corridors with childlike wonder, asking about every painting, every statue, and every closed door, her curiosity breathing life into the dust-laden corners Alexander had long forgotten. The staff, who were used to silence and orders, found themselves smiling without reason. Even Carlos Vega, the stoic head of security, softened when Lucia offered him half a cookie she had stolen from the kitchen. Alexander noticed it all, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, peace. Yet, beneath that peace, her question from the night before still lingered like a whisper in his chest. "Do you trust your guards?" It was absurd to doubt a man like Carlos, loyal, disciplined, unwavering. But once a seed of uncertainty was planted, it had a way of growing roots. He pushed it aside, telling himself it was just a child's imagination, and instead focused on the joy of her company. As the day unfolded, Lucia followed him into his office, where towering bookshelves and marble floors spoke of a man who valued perfection over comfort. She ran her fingers along the spines of books, pausing every so often to ask about titles she couldn't pronounce, and he found himself explaining things he hadn't thought about in years. Not to impress her, but because she listened, truly listened, with eyes full of wonder. When she laughed, he realized how much he had missed that sound in his life. Not the polite laughter of adults, but the pure, unguarded laughter of someone who still believed the world could be kind. It was in that laughter that Alexander began to see fragments of himself he thought were long gone, pieces of the boy who once dreamed before the man learned to calculate. By evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in shades of gold, they sat together in the garden, watching the light fade. The storm had left everything clean, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. Lucia leaned her head on her teddy bear and said softly, "You don't look lonely anymore." He turned to her, caught off guard by the truth in her words. "Maybe that's your doing," he replied gently, and she smiled. That same small, knowing smile that always seemed to carry secrets she never spoke. He didn't notice Carlos watching them from a distance, his expression unreadable, nor did he think about the question that had started to echo louder in the quiet corners of his mabulabsoa, End. For that one evening, Alexander allowed himself to forget who he was. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but just a man sitting beside a child who somehow made the world feel safe again. The air around them grew cooler, and as Lucia began to hum the same tune she had that morning, Alexander closed his eyes and listened. Each note seemed to mend something invisible inside him, stitching warmth where coldness had lived for too long. When the last note faded, he looked at her and realized that her presence wasn't just comforting, it was transforming. The mansion, his life, even his silence were no longer the same. And though he didn't yet understand it, the little girl had brought with her not only kindness, but also the first ripple of change that would test the very foundation of his world. The night had settled over the estate like a heavy blanket, quiet except for the occasional sigh of wind through the olive trees that lined the drive. Inside, the marble halls glowed faintly under dim sconces, every shadow stretching long and watchful. Lucia lay in the guest-room bed with her teddy bear pressed against her chest, trying to find sleep. But the quiet seemed too deep, too deliberate, as though the house itself were holding its breath. She rolled over, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of electricity and the ticking of a distant clock. And the thought of Alexander crossed her mind. His kind eyes when he smiled that morning, the way his laughter had sounded almost unfamiliar to him, as if she had awoken something buried. That memory should have comforted her, yet a strange unease whispered through her chest, a feeling she couldn't explain. The guards had seemed different today, speaking less, their glances sharper, and though she didn't understand why, it made her stomach twist. Finally, unable to bear the silence, she slipped from the bed, her bare feet touching the cold marble. The corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit and endless. She hesitated at the door, clutching the teddy by the arm, listening for any sound that might prove she wasn't completely alone. A faint murmur drifted from somewhere below, the low cadence of male voices, steady and careless, coming from near the garage. Curiosity tugged at her. Fear told her to stay away, but something stronger than fear, a quiet instinct she didn't recognize, made her tiptoe toward the staircase. Each step creaked softly beneath her, and the closer she came to the ground floor, the clearer the voices grew. She crouched behind the banister, heart pounding, breath shallow, the sound of her pulse filling her ears. At first, the words were just fragments, meaningless pieces of conversation. Then she heard the phrase that turned her blood to ice. The men were talking about Alexander, about his car, about tomorrow morning, about something that would happen when he stepped inside. The words carried the chill of finality. She didn't understand every detail, but the meaning was clear enough. They meant to kill him. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move. The world seemed to tilt, her tiny fingers gripping the banister until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to believe she had misheard, that it was a misunderstanding, but the laughter that followed was cruel, confident, certain. It was no mistake. The people who were supposed to protect Alexander were planning to destroy him. Her first impulse was to run back to her room, hide beneath the covers, pretend she had heard nothing. But then she saw, in her mind, the way he had looked at her earlier, the warmth in his eyes, the kindness in his voice when he said she was safe here. She couldn't stay silent. Not when someone who had shown her mercy was in danger. Gathering every shred of courage, Lucia turned and ran. Her small feet slapped against the marble as she sprinted down the long corridor, her breath coming in ragged bursts, the cold air biting at her skin. The mansion, vast and silent moments ago, now seemed to echo Wabur. Idle, with her every step, the shadows chasing her like ghosts. She didn't know exactly where Alexander was, only that he always worked late in his study. The image of him bent over papers, unaware of what awaited him, pushed her faster. She burst through the double doors of the study, tears spilling down her cheeks, her voice breaking through the quiet like a bell. "Sir, don't go near your car tomorrow. They want to kill you." Alexander looked up sharply from his desk, confusion flashing across his face, his pen falling from his hand. For a second he thought she was having a nightmare, but the terror in her eyes struck him like lightning. He rose quickly, crossing the room, kneeling beside her trembling figure. "Lucia," he said, trying to steady his voice. "What's wrong? Slow down, tell me what happened." But she shook her head, clutching his arm, her words tumbling over each other. "The guards, they were talking. They said when you get in the car, something bad will happen. Please, you can't go near it." Her voice cracked, desperation spilling out in every syllable. Alexander froze, torn between disbelief and dread. He wanted to tell her it was impossible, that his guards were loyal, that she must have misheard. But something about her panic made him hesitate. Her hands were cold, shaking uncontrollably, and her wide eyes held no deceit. "Lucia, you're safe," he said softly, though his pulse was racing. "Maybe you dreamed it. You're frightened." "I didn't dream it," she interrupted, gripping him tighter. "They said they'd do it when you get in the car. Please, you have to believe me." The sheer conviction in her trembling voice cut through every logical argument he could summon. He looked toward the window where rain had begun again, tapping softly on the glass, and for a long moment he said nothing. He thought of Carlos Vega, the man who had guarded him for a decade, the man who knew every code, every schedule, every route. Could it be true? His heart fought against the thought, but the seed of doubt was there, just as it had been since Lucia's strange question the night she arrived. He looked back at her, this fragile, frightened girl standing barefoot in his study, risking his anger just to save him. And something inside him shifted. He crouched down to meet her eyes, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You heard this clearly?" he asked quietly. And she nodded, swallowing hard. "Every word," she whispered. The innocence in her tone made the truth impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, Alexander felt fear. Not the abstract fear of losing money or power, but the raw, human fear of betrayal. He drew a long breath and straightened, his expression hardening, though his voice remained calm. "All right," he said finally. "Thank you, Lucia. You did the right thing." Her eyes widened in surprise, as though she hadn't expected him to believe her. "Now," he added, walking to the desk and pressing a small intercom button, "we'll find out if you were right." The intercom crackled softly, but Alexander's finger hovered above the button as his thoughts raced faster than his pulse. Calling the guards suddenly felt dangerous, reckless, like stepping into a trap with eyes wide open. Lucia stood near the desk, still trembling, watching him with a mixture of fear and trust, so pure it pierced through the haze of confusion, clouding his mind. He lowered his hand slowly and forced a steady breath. "No," he murmured more to himself than to her. "Not yet." The firelight flickered across his face, painting sharp lines of tension across his jaw. Every instinct honed over decades in the ruthless world of business told him to think first, act second. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was survival. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to glance at the courtyard below. 2 guards were stationed by the garage, their silhouettes faint beneath the drizzle of rain. One leaned against the wall, lighting a cigarette, while the other checked his watch. Ordinary movements. Too ordinary, he thought. A faint dread coiled in his gut. "Lucia," he said quietly, "are you sure they were talking about me? The car, not something else?" She nodded fiercely. They said it would happen when you got in, tomorrow morning. Please, sir, you can't go. The sincerity in her voice left no space for doubt. He turned away from the window, rubbing a hand over his face. All right, he whispered almost to himself. All right. His mind began mapping possibilities. How to confirm the threat, who to trust, who not to. Carlos Vega, his head of security, had been with him through mergers, blackmail attempts, even kidnapping threats. The man had saved his life once in Morocco. Could such loyalty fade? Could greed twist a decade of service into betrayal? He didn't know anymore. Power made enemies, wealth made monsters, sometimes in the faces of those who smiled at you the longest. The realization hit harder than he expected. He looked back at Lucia, small and fragile against the vastness of the study, her nightgown brushing the floor, her eyes huge and glistening with unshed tears. She shouldn't have had to bear fear like this. You're brave, he said softly, moving closer and kneeling so his voice was level with hers. You came to me when you could have hidden. That was very brave. Her lower lip trembled, and she whispered, I didn't want them to hurt you. The words nearly broke him. No one had spoken to him with that kind of care in years, not out of interest or duty, but simple, human concern. He felt something unfamiliar rise in his throat, a lump of emotion he swallowed quickly. You did the right thing, he repeated, and she nodded, tears finally spilling over. He reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Go back to your room and lock the door, he said firmly. No one will hurt either of us tonight. She wanted to protest, to stay near him, but the quiet authority in his tone convinced her. She nodded and turned toward the door, her small frame disappearing into the dark corridor. When she was gone, Alexander stood alone in the heavy silence, the sound of the rain deepening, the clock ticking with maddening calm. He crossed to his desk, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a sleek black pistol, an insurance policy he had hoped never to use. The metal felt cold against his palm, grounding him in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. He moved to the security monitors mounted in a side cabinet, switching on the feed from the garage. Two guards still stood there, talking casually, unaware they were being watched. He turned up the volume, but the hum of static drowned most of their words. Still, the tone, the relaxed confidence, was enough. They weren't on alert. They were waiting for him. The betrayal burned through his chest like acid. He sank into his chair, staring at the screens, wondering how far the conspiracy went. Was it just the guards? Carlos? More? His mind darted between names and faces, calculating risks. He thought of Lucia's trembling voice, of her small hand clutching his sleeve, and a chill ran down his spine. Without her, he would have walked into his car tomorrow morning, trusting the men who smiled as they planned his death. That thought alone made him shiver. He leaned back, exhaling shakily, and whispered to the empty room, Why me, little one? Why would you care? Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the hills, as if answering him. The storm hadn't left, it had only paused, gathering its strength. Hours passed with slow, torturous patience. Alexander didn't sleep. He watched the monitors until dawn's pale light began to bleed through the curtains. The guards changed shifts. Carlos appeared, greeting them casually before checking something near the garage door. To anyone else, it would have looked routine. To Alexander, it was confirmation. The subtle gestures, the way Carlos glanced toward the cameras as if ensuring they were off, all of it painted a truth he didn't want to see. He rose, every muscle tense, and made a decision. He would confront him, not with accusation, but with silence, the kind that forced truth to surface. Before he left the study, he glanced toward the corridor where Lucia's room was. He thought of waking her, thanking her, telling her she had saved his life. But she was sleeping, or at least he hoped she was, and he couldn't bring himself to disturb that fragile peace. He walked to the mirror, adjusted his tie out of habit, and caught sight of his own eyes. Eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, but had never looked this human, this shaken. A child had to save me, he murmured, half smiling, half broken. What does that say about the man I've become? The words hung in the still air, unanswerable. Then, straightening his shoulders, he stepped into the hall, ready to face a truth that might destroy everything he had built, but unable to ignore the trust of the little girl who had warned him when no one else would. The blast shook the ground like thunder from hell itself, and the shockwave shattered every illusion Alexander Knight had about loyalty, safety, and control. From the balcony, he stood frozen as the flames devoured what had once been his most prized car. A symbol of his power, now twisted and burning in betrayal. The air was thick with smoke and chaos. Guards shouted orders, running aimlessly, their voices laced with panic. But all the noise faded for him, replaced by a single sound, the soft, broken sob of Lucia behind him. When he turned, he saw her small face streaked with tears and ash, her hands trembling as she clutched the same worn teddy bear she'd arrived with. "I heard them say it," she whispered again, her voice trembling like glass about to break. "They wanted you gone." The words hit harder than the explosion. For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. His pulse hammered in his throat, his chest heavy, with a fury so deep it frightened even him. He had built an empire guarded by steel walls and men with guns, but it was a child's warning that had saved his life. His empire of trust had collapsed in a single morning. His mind flashed back to every handshake, every smile from the men who stood by him for years, now proven to be snakes in tailored suits. Betrayal was not new to him, but this was personal. "Stay inside," he told Lucia, his tone sharp but shaking beneath the surface. He pulled out his phone and called emergency services, his voice steady as he reported an explosion at the Knight estate. But even as he spoke, he knew this wasn't over. He ordered the mansion gates locked, guards detained, and no one allowed in or out. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. Still, amid the chaos, one question refused to leave his mind, a question more haunting than the smoke rising outside. How did this little girl know? How had she appeared out of nowhere, drenched and lost, the night before an assassination attempt? He turned to her again, studying her carefully now, searching her face for answers. She looked terrified, innocent, but innocence was something he had learned to doubt. "Lucia," he said quietly, kneeling to meet her gaze. "How did you come here? Who brought you?" She sniffled, eyes darting toward the window. "I was walking," she said softly. "It was raining and I saw your house. I didn't know where else to go." Her voice was small, fragile, and yet something about it carried a weight beyond her years. Alexander wanted to believe her, but doubt crept in like poison. He rose and looked out at the destruction again, the wreckage of his car still burning, the guards' shouts growing more frantic as the smoke spread. This wasn't random. It was planned, timed perfectly, and someone on the inside had helped make it happen. And somehow a child had walked in, to his life, just before the fire began. Was she a pawn or a miracle? He didn't know yet. But as he watched her wipe tears from her face, he felt something stir inside him, a dangerous mix of suspicion and protectiveness. She had saved him, yes, but she had also brought a mystery he couldn't ignore. "You're safe now," he murmured, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. For the first time in years, Alexander Knight, the man who feared nothing, felt a shiver of true uncertainty. He looked out at the burning remains of his past life and whispered under his breath, "Who are you, Lucia? And why did you come to me?" The truth unfolded like a storm tearing through the remnants of Alexander's already shattered composure, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. The police investigation stretched into the night, lights flashing across the mansion grounds where the blackened shell of his car still smoldered, smoke twisting like ghosts of betrayal into the pale morning sky. Officers moved quickly, gathering statements, taking fingerprints, and questioning every surviving guard. But Alexander hardly heard a word. His thoughts were consumed by the fragments of a name he hadn't spoken in years. Rafael Cortez. When the detective finally said it aloud, the sound was like acid on an open wound. Rafael, the man he had once trusted like a brother, the man he had built an empire with before greed poisoned his heart, had come back for vengeance. Years ago, Alexander had discovered Rafael siphoning company funds and manipulating investors. He'd exposed him, destroyed his career, and watched as the man was dragged through courts and humiliation. He had told himself it was justice, but now justice had turned to fire, and the fire had nearly claimed his life. Still, what left him speechless wasn't Rafael, it was Lucia. The detective's words echoed through the study as he explained what they had pieced together. Lucia's mother, Maria Alvarez, had worked as a maid in Rafael's home. She was quiet, humble, loyal. No one had known. She'd overheard his plan to eliminate Alexander once and for all. She'd tried to warn someone, anyone, but before she could, Rafael found out. There was a pause in the detective's voice then, the kind that came before tragedy. Maria had been silenced, killed to protect a secret. Alexander's hands clenched at his sides, his jaw locked, and for the first time in years the weight of guilt pressed hard on his chest. Because of his war with Rafael, an innocent woman had died, and her little girl had been left to wander the storm alone. The detective continued, explaining how Maria's final act was one of desperate courage. She'd whispered her last words to Lucia, telling her to find Mr. Knight, the man she had tried to save. And somehow, through darkness, hunger, and rain, that child had done what no adult could. She had survived. She had reached him. Alexander's vision blurred as he turned toward Lucia, who sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, hugging her teddy bear as though it was all she had left of her world. Her small face was pale, her eyes wide and tired, but filled with something pure. Hope. "Lucia," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of her name. "Your mother. She died trying to save me." The girl nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "She told me to find you," she murmured, her voice trembling like a candle in the wind. "She said you would understand." Alexander dropped to his knees before her, the billionaire mask stripped away until only a broken man remained. For years he had lived behind marble walls and security gates, believing power could protect him from the cruelty of the world. But here, before an orphaned child who had braved death for his sake, he realized how fragile he truly was. "You saved me," he said softly, his hand shaking as he touched her shoulder, "just like your mother tried to." Her lip quivered, and then she threw her arms about her, round him, sobbing into his chest. For a long moment Alexander didn't speak. He simply held her, feeling the small tremors of her body against his, and something inside him cracked wide open. A grief he didn't know he was still capable of feeling. Outside, the dawn began to rise over Madrid, painting the sky with a pale light that filtered through the shattered windows. In that fragile light, Alexander made a silent promise: to protect the little girl who had carried her mother's final message through the storm, and to make sure Maria's sacrifice would never be forgotten. For the first time in his life, he felt something more powerful than wealth or revenge. He felt purpose, and it had come to him in the form of a child who had lost everything, yet still found the courage to save a stranger. The seasons turned gently over Madrid, washing away the smoke and fear that once shadowed the Knight estate, leaving behind something purer, softer, a new life quietly growing where tragedy had once stood. Months had passed since the day Rafael Cortez and his accomplices were led away in handcuffs, their crimes exposed to the world, their vengeance silenced. Justice had finally been served, but for Alexander, justice was only part of what had been restored. What truly changed him was the small heartbeat that echoed down his marble halls each morning, the light footsteps of Lucia, the girl who had once appeared at his gates under a storm, and who now brought sunlight into every corner of his life. He couldn't bring himself to send her to an orphanage after the investigation ended. The thought of her wandering strange halls alone filled him with a cold dread he couldn't explain. So he kept her with him, not out of pity, but out of something deeper. Love that had crept in quietly, like dawn after a long night. He enrolled her in school, bought her books, and made sure she had a room filled with colors and warmth, not the sterile silence of his mansion's past. Every morning before leaving for class, Lucia would burst into his office, her laughter echoing between the high ceilings, and wrap her small arms around his waist, her head barely reaching his chest. "Good morning, Senor Knight," she'd chirp, her smile wide and honest. He'd pretend to groan, pretending to be busy with his files, but he always knelt down to hug her back. Those few seconds, her giggle, the way she'd press her cheek against his, were the moments that stitched his broken heart together. The man once known for cold efficiency now found himself pausing mid-meeting just to glance at a photo of her on his desk, the two of them smiling on her first day of school. The world soon learned of their story. Reporters came, cameras flashing, voices buzzing with curiosity, and headlines called her the little guardian angel who saved the billionaire. Alexander disliked the attention, but he never corrected them, because in his heart, he knew it was true. She hadn't just saved his life from an explosion. She had rescued his soul from isolation, taught him to trust again, to feel again. At a grand charity gala months later, under chandeliers and soft golden light, Alexander took the stage to speak. Dressed in a sleek black suit, he stood before an audience of investors, politicians, and celebrities, all waiting for one of his usual polished speeches. But this time, his tone was different, gentler, raw, human. And by his side stood Lucia in a white dress, her small hand tucked into his. He looked at her with quiet pride before turning to the crowd. "She's not just the girl who saved my life," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "She's the reason I learned what loyalty and love truly mean." The room fell silent, 1,000 hearts moved by the sincerity in his tone. Cameras flashed, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained on Lucia, who looked up at him with a smile that held all the innocence and strength her short life had taught her. When the applause finally faded, she tugged gently on his sleeve and whispered so only he could hear, "Now you're safe, Senor, and you're not alone anymore." For a moment, his composure faltered. He bent down, meeting her gaze, and in that instant, every wall he had ever built crumbled completely. "I was never safe," he whispered back, voice trembling, "until the night you knocked on my door." She hugged him again, and as he held her, Alexander felt the rare peace of a man who had finally found what no fortune could buy. A family born not from blood, but from love, courage, and destiny. Outside, the night was calm. The same sky that had once wept over a lost little girl now shimmered with stars, each one like a quiet reminder that sometimes salvation comes when you least expect it, in the smallest hands, under the fiercest storm.